Welcome to the PIER seminar, the Partners in Education Research Seminar, in a same time but a different location this semester. Today we have the great privilege of having Sarah Cohodes come back. Sarah used to work here at the Center for Education Policy Research and was a graduate student at Harvard's Kennedy School. Sarah's going to be talking to us today about an important question, not just like what is the effect of charter schools on student achievement, which is something that Sarah and others have worked on in the past, but rather when schools that appeared effective based on earlier lotteries, when they were allowed to expand, were they able to replicate the same results? So it's an important question on whether efficacy can be replicated or whether it's just sort of like a one-time thing that's hard to spread. Okay, so Sarah. Oh, I should have said Sarah's. I said what her roots were, or what she's doing. She's an assistant professor now at Teachers College at Columbia.
All right, thanks for having me. It's good to be home, and the weather just makes it feel more like home. So, so I'm glad to be here today to talk to you about charter schools. So among the others that Tom spoke of who have done work on this is, of course, Tom himself. So I have him to thank for helping me get started on this research topic. I want to start by just laying the groundwork a little bit about what we know about charter schools, and then to dive into this question around whether or not successful schools can replicate. I think you guys are used to interspersing questions as you go, and I welcome them, and if I need to move on, I will let you know. I wanted to highlight that I'm going to be bringing up some work from two of my papers. One is sort of a review of what has been going on in the charter school research in the past 10 years. I have this piece in The Future of Children. And then also this paper with my colleagues Elizabeth Cetrin and Chris Walters, where we look specifically at this question of replication. Right. So one of the cool things about doing charter school research for the past 10 years or so is that a lot of other people have been doing it as well. And I'm feeling that now we are starting to be able to say a lot about whether or not charter schools make a difference in kids' lives, and have a lot of evidence on that. The evidence comes primarily from two different sources: lottery-based studies that take advantage of the fact that when more students apply to charters than there are seats available, those seats are allocated by lotteries. And when we have that lottery, we can take advantage of it in the same way we would a randomized controlled trial. And then observational studies, which use various methods to try and create a control group based on matching or based on regression or fixed effects to say who looks a lot like the charter school students. Pros and cons of each approach. With those lottery-based studies, we're limited to the schools that have oversubscription, and we might think that oversubscribed schools are not representative of charter schools as a whole. With the observational studies, we can include all of those schools, which is a big advantage. But the disadvantage, of course, is we're not certain that we've purged selection bias from all of those estimates. The nice thing is that both of those types of evidence have converged on a few facts that I think are correct about charter schools in the US. And on average, we don't really see a difference between students who are educated in charter school versus a traditional public school. When I talk to just people I meet, relatives, whatever, they are super shocked by this because they assume, given all of the conversation about charters in terms of politics, in terms of newspaper stories, that they would be making either a big difference for the better or for the worse in students' lives on average. And we don't see that. And the evidence on that comes mostly from observational studies, because they're the ones that are able to bring in the whole array of charter schools, but also lottery-based studies that have a broad base that look across different states and different situations tend to find, on average, no effect from attending just any charter. But there is a consistent exception to this, and that is charter schools that serve low-income minority populations, primarily in urban areas. We have lottery-based evidence from Boston, New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Denver, and KIPP that these schools have big benefits for the students who attend them. That comes in the form of charter school impacts on test scores, but also in both Boston, New York, and Chicago. I should have Chicago on that last bullet point there. We see that those gains persist into college entrance. An unknown is whether going to college translates into graduating college, and whether those going to college and graduating college, whether that translates into better outcomes in terms of employment and wages. And hopefully there will be future work that helps us answer those questions. So in that context, many of these schools share a set of practices which we and sometimes those charter schools call no excuses practices. Though if you talk to charter schools in the past few years, they're starting to move away from that label, perhaps because some of bad press around no excuses charter schools. And the practices we tend to see in those schools are longer school days and years, high academic and behavioral expectations. Sometimes that's in the form of a merit-demerit style discipline system. Sometimes that's in the form of uniforms. But you also see things like the expectation that every child is going to go to college, classrooms that are named after colleges. The expectation that every child can do a high level of work. We also see frequent teacher feedback in these schools, and the original phrasing of no excuses was around adults, not around teachers. The idea was there was no excuse for the adults in the classroom for them in terms of whether or not they could do what it takes to help students succeed. We also see high-intensity tutoring and data-driven instruction. But what we have not seen is any school district adopting these policies on a wide scale. And we also tend to see where there are no excuses charter schools, they tend to serve a small share of students in a given locality. So that leaves a question that seems obvious to me. We have these schools that are having big impacts on students. We see that those impacts go beyond test scores into outcomes that we care about a lot, whether or not you go to college. And to me that says, okay, we found something that works. Can we replicate it? Can we take what worked in a certain situation for some kids and make it work in a new situation for new kids, maybe in a very similar situation? Massachusetts gives us a perfect case study for that. In 2010, and this happened around the Race to the Top policy, and many states changed charter school policy in order to respond to the Race to the Top criteria. Massachusetts lifted restrictions on the number of charters that could exist in Massachusetts. In particular in low-performing districts. The cap in Massachusetts has related both to the number of schools and the amount of funding that can go towards charter school students. So the cap increased for the funding as well. But the interesting thing about Massachusetts, and I'm not aware of any other state that has this policy, is instead of just saying, we're going to go through our normal process for charter schools and authorizing them, they said, we're going to focus on schools that were successful in the past, so-called proven providers. And we're going to allow those campuses to open up new schools and not other schools. So charters responded to this. Many of them applied to open new campuses, and not everybody who applied to open a new campus was permitted to open. So the state, which is the sole authorizer in Massachusetts, went through a selection process to decide who they were going to permit to open new schools. And over the next 4 years, both the number and the share of students enrolled in charter schools doubled over that time period. So the number is looking at all charter schools in Boston. The percentage of students is focusing on middle school students, which is where charters have had the largest population. So this blue line here is showing the population of the share of population in Boston in 6th graders who are enrolled in a charter school. And we can see that sharp increase starting with the law, the change in the law. And we also see growth in terms of the elementary school and high school charters as well. High school is the green line, and elementary school is the red line. But the largest share of growth came in middle schools, and that's where we focus our work.
So the overall cap is around 18%, and Boston's at it. But I hadn't quite realized just how different the share was in different sectors.
Yeah.
So it only averages out to 18 because there are very few charters operating in elementary school.
Right. So there is no way to expand. You can't expand any more charter schools in Boston. There is some growth that has already been planned for based on charter schools opening 1 grade at a time. But there are no longer any more seats available. And this focus on middle schools means that fewer than 18% of students are enrolled in charter schools in high schools and elementary schools in order to accommodate that large growth in middle schools. And it means that and it's not necessarily the case that it's true, but even if all charter school students in middle school wanted to go on to a charter school high school, it would not be possible for that to happen. Eric?
If you could plot some measure of demand in the same way, say by the number of people who signed up for the lotteries, does that also change over time? Or maybe you're going to show that.
Yeah. So the percent of Boston students applying to Boston middle schools jumped from about 15% on average over those pre-expansion years to about 35% after expansion. In the most recent year that we have data on, I think it's about 45% of middle school students in Boston are applying to at least one charter school.
And one follow-up question, did it look like it changed after, did it also have sort of a trend break in 2010? Did that change the way families were thinking about charter schools, or has that always been increasing?
So it does look like there is a trend break. So you could draw a curve. You could draw draw 2 lines, and I can talk a little bit more about where this expansion is coming from, and which I will do when we get to this slide for real.
So you might be getting this, but why focus on middle schools? Why would the charters focus on middle schools?
Part of it is that is where charter schools have focused historically a lot of their expansion and energy, and so they feel like that's what they know how to do, and that's where they're ready to replicate. Part of it comes from most families are very satisfied with their elementary school and are not necessarily looking for another option. And then when it comes to middle school is when they are starting to look for more options and are more willing to maybe go a little bit farther to enroll their kid in a different school. And so I think there is just more demand once we hit the middle school level. High school is hard and expensive because if you want to offer a full array of classes, you need to staff that even if you don't have enough kids to offer drama and AP history and all of those things. And so I think high school is something that the charters are slowly transitioning into offering more of. And now in Boston, they've hit the cap. There's no more place to grow there. So the goal of this paper is twofold. The first is to figure out, did this effort at replication work? Can successful schools replicate? We're also interested in whether the state did a good job selecting proven providers. And what to me is the most interesting part of this paper, and where I'm hoping that we can spend most of our time, is talking about what explains the success of the scaling. So not just did it work, and spoiler alert, I will tell you it did work, but why did it work, and what can we figure out in terms of potential explanations as explaining why it was possible for it to work. So we're focusing on 14 charter middle schools in Boston. In recent years, that covers almost 95% of enrollment in charter schools. We are missing one school which closed over this time period. You can't collect records from an entity that does not exist, and one other charter school which has never returned any of our phone calls, emails, or other attempts at contact. And we are dividing these schools into three types. 4 are these proven providers, the ones that the state designated as successful schools. 7 are these expansion campuses. And then 3 other charters. So those are campuses that existed, which were not permitted to expand. They may very well have applied to expand, and some of them did, and the state said, no, we're not going to give you permission to expand. What else sort of changed over this time period? We saw a big increase in the number of applications to charters, and I think that is coming from 2 things. So one is this latent demand. There were people who wanted to apply, but maybe there was no school near them, or they thought, okay, charter schools are only for this kind of kid, and I'm not that kind of kid, but maybe now that there's a school nearby, I'll throw my hat in the ring. And then part of this change in law was not just around how charter schools were selected in terms of who got authorized, but also in terms of what the charter schools needed to do to recruit students. So they needed to put a recruitment plan in place in which they focused on recruiting students, including students with special needs and students who were English learners. And part of the law also required the district to share a list of addresses of, for instance, 4th graders in Boston Public Schools, so that the charter schools, if they wanted to, could do mailers. And each school had to file a plan with the state where they said, these are our recruitment efforts. So I think this big change in applications is due both to sort of naturally occurring demand coming from word of mouth and coming from new campuses opening nearby, and then also a very concerted effort to try and recruit more students. We also saw a change in who applied to the charter schools. Before the expansion, students who applied were positively selected, so they had higher test scores, they were less likely to have free or reduced price lunch. And after the expansion, the test scores were on par in terms of who was applying. And about 80% of the students who were applying received free or reduced price lunch. We also saw a big increase in the number of English language learners who applied, and sort of a percentage of special education students who applied sort of stayed flat. That huge increase in the number of English language learners is an artifact both of these recruitment efforts, but also from Boston over this time period due to a big lawsuit sort of changed their classification procedures and were classifying a lot more students who should have been English learners in the past and who were not being classified as such. And so that's part of why we see such a dramatic change over time in terms of English learners.
Sarah, was it also due to, like, with the expansion, wasn't part of the legislation that charters were now going to be evaluated on the percentage of their students that were ELL in special ed?
So they were required to file that plan, but there was not a formal consequence outside of the normal review process in which that could be taken into account among any other of the things that could be taken into account in terms of chartering. There are other places, New York, for example, made it a rule that the charter schools would need to reflect the same percentages in terms of English learners and students with disabilities. However, to my knowledge, that law has not been enforced in any way. So the students applying to charter schools after the expansion, for the most part, look like students in Boston as a whole. One difference that is in the paper, which is not highlighted in this table, is that the charter applicant pool tends to be more Black and less Latino. That seems to reflect the neighborhoods that the charter schools are located in, and also perhaps this historical issue with recruiting English learners. When we first started doing work around charter schools, a lot of people talked about, oh, these schools are only serving, a subset of the population, this special group. And to some extent, that criticism was true. The people who were applying to charter schools as a whole were higher performing than students in the district as a whole. And after this expansion, the students in the schools really tend to look like the average student in Boston. All right, so what are we going to do? We're going to jointly estimate the charter attendance at these 5 types of charter schools, proven providers and other charters before the expansion. And then after the expansion, proven providers, expansion charters, and other charters. Why am I emphasizing this jointly estimate thing? We want to make sure that we have the right counterfactual. So many of these students who are applying to a charter school or apply to more than one charter school, and we don't necessarily want a student who is applying to both a proven provider and an expansion charter. That student making the comparison between the two, we might not see any difference, but that would imply that the charters, those 2 types of charters were performing similarly. So we want to make sure our comparison group are folks who are in traditional public schools. So folks who are applying through the lottery, but comparing to folks in traditional public schools. And so how are we estimating this thing? We're using a 2-stage least squares strategy, where we use our lottery offer as an instrument for whether or not you attend. And we use an offer, both are you offered on the day of the lottery, and do you ever receive an offer at that charter school. And we condition everything based on charter school risk sets, or some people call them lottery fixed effects, where we're only making comparisons within groups of students who apply to the same sets of charter schools. So if we have people who are a group of students who are applying to a proven provider, an expansion charter, and their fallback option is the traditional public schools, we're going to contribute to the proven provider and the expansion charter estimate compared to the traditional public school estimate. If we have somebody who's only applying to an other charter, we're going to contribute to that other charter versus traditional public school estimate. We go through the usual procedures to make sure that the lotteries that we're using have not been manipulated in any way, and what we check there is that the student characteristics are similar whether you win the lottery or whether you lose the lottery, and that you're just as likely to appear in the data whether you win the lottery or whether you lose the lottery. And that's the sort of setup that allows us to estimate our big system of equations. So in this system of equations, we have K for stages. What is K? K are all of our charter types. So for each charter type, we're estimating your attendance at C, the years of charter attendance at a charter school type, so one of these 5 particular types. We're estimating it as a function of our 2 offers. Those Z's are our instruments. We're including grade fixed effects to account for the fact that students are in different grades. And we also include our risk sets to account for the different groups of schools you might be applying to, as well as student demographics. 1 second, but I see you. What we do is we include a student in multiple years in the data. So if you have a test score in 6th grade, you contribute. If you have a test score in 7th grade, you contribute. But we cluster our standard errors by student to account for the fact that there are multiple estimates coming from a student here. And we use that to estimate our second stage, where we use years of charter school attendance to predict our outcome, which in this case are math and ELA MCAS scores. Thomas?
Yeah, just to be clear, you've got the risk sets are amongst the K equals 3 types, or amongst the 14 schools?
So the risk sets are amongst the schools, so they're the unique set of school by years lotteries that you have applied to.
Okay, so there's 14, K is 14.
So K is 5, those are our charter school types. Our risk sets are coming from those 14 schools, interacted with years, and so we have, I don't remember, but like 200 risk sets or something over our set of charter schools.
So every permutation of charter schools that people apply to multiple ones.
But I'm just thinking, if I applied to 2 different proven provider schools, that's still only 1 risk set within a given year because they're both the same.
So if you apply to 2 different proven provider charter schools, you're going to be in a risk set with other people who've also applied to that same set of schools, and you're going to contribute to our estimate of the proven provider effect. All right. Oh, sure, Peter.
Do you look at the demand side of this in terms of like the introduction of a new proven school? Like, how does that affect demand for like the other schools too? Or is
So-
it a separate paper?
Yeah, I think that's a separate paper. We haven't looked at that formally. So, and one complication is some of these schools have a unified application. So for usually if you apply to a parent campus or an expansion campus, you can say, yes, I would be willing to go to this one and that one as well. So like that demand is going to be highly correlated because many people just fill out the application and say that they'll go to any of the campuses. All right, so I'm going to show you the results for math scores. There's a very similar pattern for ELA, which I'll show you briefly, but I'm going to go through here. And then we can start to dig into the mechanisms. So the first thing that we find is that proven providers are more effective than other charter schools. So public policy worked. The authorizer, the state, was able to identify the more successful schools when they were deciding who they were going to permit to replicate. They could have called us up and said, you know, can you generate some lottery estimates for us to do this? But they didn't, and you can also understand why they wouldn't want to make their process rely on an external partner. So as part of their application, schools needed to submit evidence of their success, which they could do in multiple ways in order to be deemed a proven provider.
Was one of those ways like growth scores?
They could say growth scores. They could say, you know, you could become a proven provider even if you were not in Massachusetts before by saying, you know, this is our evidence of success in New Jersey or nationwide or whatever based on some form of value added or level scores or internal growth measure or any, you know, if you have a pre-test and a post-test, anything like that.
How would you do the lottery approach to get estimates for individual schools to rank which schools were proven? Like, if they had come to you, what would you have done exactly?
That's a good question because you have to take into account the fact that people are potentially applying to multiple schools. So, one approach would be to do something like this joint estimate where we have 5 charter types, but instead of doing the 5 charter types, to have it be the 14 schools, accounting for the risk sets of where you could potentially apply for. Another approach would be to just isolate the data for the individual school and look at the effect there. Having not been asked the question, I'm not entirely sure what I would have done, but my guess is I would have leaned on the similar approach to what we're doing here.
But just do it for each school, each type is one school.
Yeah. Sophie.
Are you going to show how demand changes with the different types? Like the lottery sets?
So I showed you the number overall. I think we have it in a table in the paper where we show at the different types. I don't have that here. One of the interesting things about this is that some of the schools with the largest demand are the other charters, which seems potentially contradictory or interesting. It also is potentially a bit of a historical artifact because those are some of the oldest schools in Boston. And so they've had the longest time to form a reputation. They also are maybe the most well-known, and where they are located is appealing to some families. So that's a partial answer to your question. The other answer is I think we have that in a table, but we're not focusing on that in this part of the paper. No, it's not consistent that the proven providers are necessarily always higher demanded than the other charters. And when new campuses open, sometimes there is a little bit of a dip in demand, which makes sense because if a new campus opens nearby and that's closer to you than the old campus, you might prefer the newer campus. So, and I should say, before I move on, the effect of attending a proven provider per year of attendance is about 1/3 of a standard deviation in standardized math scores. The effect of attending another charter is about 0.2 standard deviations in math test scores per year of attendance. These effects are very large, so these are per year effects, and I think in no other context would we say that a 0.2 standard deviation effect per year of attendance is small. It's only that it happens to be smaller than the effect that we saw for the proven providers. Eric.
In the original Boston lottery estimates, the first stage was like, for middle schools, I think, was about 1 year. Is that all?
Yes.
Still true here?
Yes. And Yes, yes. Part of that is an artifact of the fact that we have the different grades. So in 6th grade, you can only potentially be there 1 year. In 7th grade, you can potentially be there 2 years. In 8th grade, you can potentially be there 3 years.
So how cautious should we be about extrapolating 0.32 to is it going to be 0.32 plus 0.32 plus 0.32?
So, that would make some assumptions about linearity, which, we can estimate grade by grade, and we do see statistically significant effects at each grade level, but it's not exactly the same grade by grade. But it's not, I haven't run the t-test to tell you whether or not they're statistically different from each other.
But even if they're the same grade by grade, that doesn't mean necessarily for an individual student.
Correct. Blake.
I don't know if you guys have done this, but have you been able to run these with the 14 different school effects? And if so, how much heterogeneity is there within each group? Are there certain other charters that really get out of the park, or does that look like?
So obviously things group around the mean because that's what they average out to. There are occasional outliers. Not everything is perfect. I'm going to push forward because I see my time going, but we'll continue to take questions. So our first question is, how did they do after, in this period after expansion? Did proven providers remain effective? You could very well think that these organizations, which are now in some cases moving staff, are expending energy on these new campuses. They could reduce their effectiveness. and we see no difference across this time period in terms of their effectiveness. Okay, how did the expansion charters do? The expansion charters had a very large and similar effect when it came to test scores, about a third of a standard deviation in terms of math test scores, and there was no statistical difference between the proven providers and the expansion campuses. This was not my prior. My prior was that the new campuses, like maybe they would have been successful, but not as successful. There's some observational research out of Texas that says new charter schools are lower performing than older charter schools. And I didn't think it was a given that the schools were going to be successful when they replicated, but they were. We continue to see that both the expansion campuses and the proven provider campuses are higher performers than the other charters, and they end up performing at about the same rate as they did before the expansion PIER.
What kind of incentives did they face? Like, if they failed or whatever, like, did the state say that we were above your charter, or for both schools, or for one school?
So all charters in Massachusetts face a rechartering process where they cannot be rechartered if either they're do poorly academically, if there's a financial problem, they can't generate enough enrollment, which usually is tied closely to financial problems. So all the charters were subject to that process as well. There was sort of a little bit of a change in how they did things. So when they initially instituted the policy, the new campuses had their own charter. And then, so they would have been evaluated on a new 5-year clock, and the original campus would have been evaluated on their original 5-year clock. And then they went through a process where they realized maybe that doesn't make a ton of sense. And so the expansions that were more recent as well, they went back and sort of adjusted the previous expansions where they all put them together on one charter, and then are now evaluated as a group, considering each campus as part of that charter. We don't, I think I would have to check to be sure. I think it's possible that one campus could be subject to sanctions and another campus would not be.
I think that'd be an interesting mechanism, because it might be like what's happening here is by tying their fortunes together,
Right.
you're making an incentive compatible to make sure that the second charter is as good as the first, right? And so in some sense, that could be another one, an additional lesson from this experience, which is that we should not only allow proven charters to expand, but in addition to that, we should also link the fortunes of the new campus to the old campus, so that if you mess up, you basically lose your charter for both places, and so you're even more on the ball in terms of making sure that it works.
I would have to check to make sure that that mechanism holds before I put that forth as my theory. So, okay. We saw a similar pattern in English language arts, though in general the effect sizes in English language arts are smaller, and this difference was not statistically significant in the pre-period. All right, so this is the part that I'm most excited about, so I want to talk to you more about it after I answer this question.
Did the expansion charters open one grade at a time?
They tended to open one grade at a time, or sometimes 2 grades at a time, and then adding grades on up. And there was variation in terms of some places opened 2 campuses at once, some opened 1 at once, some opened 1, and then the next year opened another campus in terms of how they opened.
For those that opened 2 or more grades at a time, could that have affected sort of the magnitude of your estimates, given that all the students were relatively new to a charter school setting, whereas in existing charters, the 6th graders or 7th graders had already experienced the previous grade?
So we do an exercise, and it's buried in an appendix somewhere, where we sort of rejigger it so that the grade levels are exactly the same across the before and the after, and we end up with like the same results if we reweight things to take into account the grade levels. So, All right, so we have sort of three main theories about what could be happening in these schools in terms of potentially generating these effects. And if you have another testable proposition, I would love to hear it. So one idea is we did see this change in demographics, and perhaps one of the reasons that the post-expansion charters are having these large effects is because they are educating students who charter schools are particularly good at being effective for. Another explanation would be that the new expansion campuses were located in areas with particularly poor performing alternative options. And our third option is maybe it's something about the school model and the school practices, and that the management, the style of how they do their teaching are very similar, and they're able to successfully replicate their model, which we look at both through an examination of value added and through some talking to the school leaders and hearing about the practices. All right, so let's start to test this. To figure out whether or not it's student characteristics that are driving the results, we do something in the style of a Oaxaca blinder decomposition, where we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the average effect of attending a charter school for a particular type, so, you know, for the average kid in Boston. And then what is the effect of attending a particular type for a specific kid who might have lower test scores or higher test scores or be from this demographic group or that demographic group? How effective is this charter school for the mix of kids that it happens to get who applies to them? We did see that the expansion charters tend to enroll lower baseline students. To some extent, that makes sense. These schools were recruiting more students to come to them, and where if they had already been recruiting these higher scoring students, the places to recruit new students were coming from lower scoring students. And previous work by my co-author Chris and many of the papers on charter schools highlights that schools tend to be most effective for these lower scoring students. But we show with this decomposition that that bump that you get from having a population that charters generate particularly large gains for accounts for maybe 5% of the effectiveness in math and about 8% of the charter impact in ELA. So, and I'll show you the tables that show this in a second. We do see that student characteristics do contribute to the charter effects, but we think the scale is so small that that's not really an explanation about what's driving this expansion effect. So this just shows you in Greek what I just said to you, hopefully in English. So the main idea is we are decomposing between an average effect and a match effect, and to generate instruments to help us estimate this, we interact or offer instruments with characteristics, student characteristics, which we then use to estimate this average treatment effect and this match effect. So what do we see? So we're able to, I'm going to focus just on this after expansion because we're focusing on explaining the expansion effect. And what we see is that the average charter effect takes into account how this school would work for the average kid. And then we can see right below it the match effect, which says, okay, given the particular mix of students that you got, what additional bump did you get from getting that mix of students? And as you can see, it's just a very small share of what is going on. Okay, so that was one explanation, which we don't think is driving what we're finding. Our next potential explanation is are the expansions effective because they are locating in areas where the options in the traditional public school are particularly poor performing? And in order to look at that, we estimate a value added score for all of the schools in Boston. And we look and we say, okay, so what is the average value added of the schools attended by the folks who are not given an offer? And here we're estimated the untreated complier mean in particular. And if our idea that the expansion charters were located in particularly poor performing areas was true, then we should see that the value added of the schools that they attend on average is lower than the value added for charters in other sectors. And we don't see any evidence of that. I'll show you the graph in a second. I thought I might have a little animated box to highlight that, Tom.
So Sarah, so here you've had to like do a little jujitsu, or you're changing from that decomposition approach to like, okay, now we're going to estimate value. But it seems to me you ought to be able to apply exactly the same structure, but instead of using student traits, using neighborhoods. Like, so if you broke up the city into neighborhoods and then say, okay, I'm going to estimate, you know, the likelihood of getting it, how the likelihood changed of getting into these various kinds of places. You know, you could even use that to say, okay, well, how much of the change was the change in the average effectiveness of the schools that became available in certain neighborhoods, you know, versus
Defining neighborhoods by the value added of the schools in the neighborhoods, or by the neighborhood characteristics?
So you could do like the literally
Just the neighborhood, yeah.
You know, and then just do that same treatment on a tree,
Yeah.
and then or
Yeah.
the average, and then the interaction.
We haven't done that, but it seems cool. So, another way I can show you that the fallback option doesn't seem to be related to the charter type is just by graphing the results. And our replication campuses are these squares, and it, in general, does not seem like there is a relationship between our outside options and the charter school effect. So I think it was Blake who was asking about school heterogeneity. You can see a little bit of that in here, though that wasn't what we were particularly driving at with this graph.
So each dot is a school?
And so we don't have a lot of evidence for the outside option, and so again, there goes sort of our next potential explanation for what is going on. So the next thing that we thought about was what is actually happening in these schools? What are the organizational practices? What are the teaching practices? What's going on in these expansion schools? And how is that similar or different than what was going on in the proven providers? So we, in a strange and uncomfortable move for economists, spoke to human beings and talked with charter leaders in these organizations that were expanding. And then we also, more in an area sort of more in our wheelhouse, did an examination of teacher value added. So what we found as a whole were that proven providers had a model that they believed was effective for their students, and they then went to implement the same thing in the new campus. In terms of how they structured the school day, they had similar amounts of instructional time, especially for core subjects. They had these no excuses practices around high expectations and disciplinary practices. They implemented tutoring and homework help and Saturday programming. We saw that in terms of the teacher population, about 10% of the teachers from the proven provider campuses moved to the new campuses, where they accounted for about 1/3 of the teaching staff at the new campuses. The numbers don't add up because there were smaller teaching cores at the new campuses because they were opening up 1 or 2 grades at a time. And so a lot of what they were doing was supporting all of these new teachers that were coming into these schools, where over 2/3 of them were new teachers. So they did co-lesson planning across the campuses. So successful teachers in the proven providers were sharing their curriculum and giving feedback to the new teachers and working with them around their lessons. And the leaders of the new campuses tended to be people who were, for instance, like a grade level leader in the proven provider campus. So they were taking somebody who had been successful at the original campus and giving them a leadership opportunity. This implied that they were using a highly standardized practice, and they were indoctrinating these new teachers into this practice in terms of what they expected in the classroom. And they were doing that in the expansion campuses, but they also did that in their own campuses when there were new teachers, and there is teacher turnover at these campuses. So there is this opportunity, and they've had this experience in terms of bringing teachers into this experience and training them in their expectations and in their model. Tom.
Like, so I don't know what percentage of teachers in the home, I forget what is the
Proven providers.
Provider campuses were novice teachers, but say it was 10%. So if there were 2/3 in the new, 10% in the first, you'd expect like a 0.5 times, 0.10 decline in the first year. That would then, but even if the steady state, things the same, they'd like catch up.
Right. So Tom is talking about the fact that in general we see that novice teachers have a lower value added. And one of the things that we are interested in is exploring this. So if you're staffing a campus with 2/3 of novice teachers, you would expect there to be lower value added at that school. But over time, as those teachers, over 4 or 5 years, gained experience, you would expect that school to perform, at a similar level. One of the things that we wanted to do, and this is suggestive evidence, you can see that our p-values are not statistically significant, but we did look at the experience profile in terms of the gains we saw to an additional year of an experience in charters versus BPS. So when we're running value added or looking at these teacher characteristics, we always have a dummy in there that accounts for what sector you're in, because if we don't do that, then the charter schools look like they have these huge effects because we see this big difference across sectors. And unfortunately, we just don't have a big enough sample size to do this differently for every single type of charter school. We just have to group all of the charter schools together.
I think I might have missed this, so apologies. So there were 7 new proven provider schools.
7 expansion campuses.
Okay. And how many parent campuses?
4 parent campuses.
So what's the maximum that each sort of provider goes from? Is it like 1 to 4?
Yes. Each is 1 is 1 to 1, 1 is 1 to 2, 1 to 3, and 1 to 4, I think, are the different things that we see. But most of them, if they have more than 1 campus, are not necessarily adding that campus in the same year. So in another year, they add that additional campus.
And is there a heterogeneity in terms of the number of campuses that they're adding?
Yes.
Are these stepwise regression coefficients, or are these double?
Oh, so these are dummy variables for each of these groups compared to novices. Novices are our left out category. And because there are just not a ton of charter school teachers with more than 5 years of experience in math and ELA classes in our time period, and in general there aren't, like it's not possible to differentiate this further in terms of all of the steps. So we view this as suggestive evidence that charter schools, while they have not gotten rid of the novice penalty that we see elsewhere, they sort of have made it so that experience matters less in terms of how effective you are in your teaching. And another way that we can look at that is by looking at the variance components that come out of a value-added setup. Yeah. So yeah. The point estimates are different. So that's why I said it's suggestive. So I don't want to get too excited about it. Though what is interesting to me, more interesting to me, is that we see that the variation is reduced at both the teacher and the classroom level at charters as compared to traditional public schools. So what am I showing you here? When you're generating these teacher value addeds, you get a component for the school, a component for the teacher, a component for the classroom, and then we can look at those variances of those components. So this is telling us how spread out are those teacher value addeds, how spread out are those school effects, how spread out are those classroom effects.
Sorry, you're fitting a multi-level model with 3 levels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Classrooms nested in teachers.
Nested in schools.
Nested in schools.
And we continue to have a dummy in there for what sector you are, which accounts for the fact that the charters are a different sector, or as a whole are performing at a much higher level of performance than the traditional public schools.
But it's one model.
It's all estimated together. Melanie.
How many of the proven provider schools were schools that had maybe like expanded from other states or from other places in Massachusetts, as opposed to schools that had like a standalone campus in Boston and were opening new campuses?
So they were all homegrown, and that is sort of a historical accident in Massachusetts because of the cap as a whole. Like most of the providers in Massachusetts are homegrown providers, though there are 2 KIPP schools in Massachusetts, and some of the charters, while they didn't start off as Uncommon schools, they ended up affiliated with the network of Uncommon schools, which has schools up and down the East Coast, and also not just on the East Coast.
I'm confused. So for your school, you estimated the variance of the random effect for a charter school, which is the 3rd level of a multi-level model with like 17 schools?
So we have the 14 charter schools, and then we have I don't remember the exact number of Boston middle schools in the traditional public schools as well.
But you have separate variance. You're fitting one model with 2 variants.
Yes. Mark?
Is the variance in the 2 sectors the same at the residual level? Like, are students varying like the same amount in their outcomes on charter BPS?
Can you say that again?
I'm wondering, since we're looking at standard deviations, is it like something mechanical about like there is less variation in student outcomes at the charter school level in some way potentially? That we see the smaller variance here.
Did you have the same variance parameter at the residual level?
Yeah, there is, and so the charter schools are higher scoring, but there's not a ceiling effect going on. They're scoring across the range, and they're coming in low enough that there's a lot of variation in the potential outcomes that they can have. Let me just say what I think this says, and then we can debate whether it says what I think it says. Here I'm showing the different variances from a random effects model split by sector, and we see that while there is difference across sectors, at the school level, there doesn't seem to be a difference in terms of the spread of effects around those means, those 2 different means. But at the teacher level, we see that there is a reduction in variation, that the teachers in the charter sector, the distribution of value addeds for those teachers is just tighter than it is in the traditional public sector. And we see a similar thing happening at the classroom level. This was the most surprising thing to me that I found because Tom was my boss and mentor, and I always thought about this classroom component as the dog barking outside while the students were taking the test. So if the dog is barking outside some charter classrooms, it's barking outside some traditional public classrooms, we should probably see similar variation in charter classrooms as we saw in traditional public school classrooms. But that's not what we saw. We saw this reduction in variation. And I think this is potentially implying that something is going on in terms of classroom management, in terms of standardizing the experiences of what's happening in charter schools as opposed to what's happening in traditional public schools, in terms of sort of taking out those classroom level perturbations.
Yeah, I think this is super interesting as well too. Are you able to look at this before the expansion happened?
We can't, just because the state only has the teacher-student links in the years post-expansion, so we don't have those links pre-expansion.
Can you separate this out for?
No. I like that was, we wanted to do it so badly, and there just aren't. Okay.
Like for the homeschool, sorry, I said homeschool, but so the parent good charter and the parent proven charter, and then the kind of like offspring proven charter, to see like if it's really the offspring is mimicking the parent, or the offspring is even better than the parent.
So like the sample size in those two groups is just so small that we don't have a huge amount of variation there to take advantage of. So we were just more comfortable grouping all of the charters together than splitting into those three categories, because the sample size in any given one of the sectors is small, because we need to have a teacher that we have multiple years of data for in a tested subject in a tested grade.
Are there enough instances in the data set of non-no-excuse charters to include a dummy to capture the effect of that model?
Not in this particular context. That's something that is possible to look at across the state, but so many things are different across those contexts that it's hard to say. There are very few charter schools in Boston that either don't adhere to no excuses practices or don't do something that is quite similar to no excuses practices, even if they don't use those words to describe what they're doing.
Was there a separate residual variance for these two different sectors? And if so, were they different too?
So I don't remember. I can look it up.
The difference in teachers in the standard deviations at the teacher level is certainly fascinating. I wonder if it's actually not even smaller than it would be if we could account for experience, because the composition of the teachers in those two groups.
This is accounting for experience. So yeah. So we just estimated that directly in the model, and then let these parameters vary.
We have good evidence that the mean of experience is going up.
Yeah.
But actually, the variation, the variance of performance as experience increases shrink. So, but you think just controlling for the.
So like this, so potentially, like we could control for experience in a different way than we're controlling for it, because we're just controlling for those two buckets. So given the fact that BPS has like a substantial number of teachers with 15 plus years of experience, we could potentially control in that sector differently, but just we are taking into account those two buckets when we're looking at this. Sure, Luke. Yeah, no.
I'm stunned. I'm just not used to 3 inference on
Yeah.
your variances and your random effects. And in particular, being able to test that 0.12
Yeah.
and 0.18 are different from each other when I guess your charter teachers are numbering a few hundreds maybe?
Charter teachers less than that. So it looks similar if we exclude the school parameter, I believe. So if we just reduce the number of models and focus on teacher and class, it like I wouldn't have numbers to show you if it didn't converge. So
I'm just
yeah.
wondering, like, how sensitive was the model?
Yeah.
How are you doing the testing of the two variance parameters?
Yeah.
Especially
Yes.
when it was
Yeah.
like a likelihood ratio test?
I'm thinking about what the code looks like. I think it is likelihood ratio test, and I think we're using XT mixed instance data to estimate it, and this is what happened.
I would recommend bootstrapping your schools and seeing how your variance parameters change by perturbing your data directly. And if you do that, please send me an email because
Okay.
I'm dying to know if it's different.
But these are middle schools, so the sample size per teacher is bigger
Yeah.
than like an elementary school.
So
It's like nested out in class, right? Like you have your random effect per student, and then you have a random effect for each class by year.
Yeah, so I expect, the thing that's surprising is the class by year is identified. Like the teacher, you'd expect to be pretty well.
well, I mean, so we have like 4 or 5 classrooms per teacher per year.
4 or 5 classrooms per teacher per year. So, and then you have a few years, so it's like 20 classrooms per teacher.
Yes.
It's just, so much bigger. I live in the dark world.
Oh, yeah. All right. So I'm interested in talking more about this because to me this is the most interesting part about the paper. But I am conscious about the time and want to make sure that we have 10 minutes because we're going to 5:30. I thought we were going to 5:15. Excellent. Anybody want to talk about this more? Should we pull up the code, Blake?
Something that you directly tested or talked about, but if I'm a real skeptic here, maybe part of what I think is happening is that new schools are opening and they're drawing talent away from traditional public schools. And so one thing you can look at if you observe teachers who are teaching both the PPS and the charter sector, no difference between value added. Does value added translate across sectors?
Yeah.
Things like that.
So that is something that I have been interested in. We don't see a lot of cross-sector things going on, and where there is cross-sector change, it usually is charter schools going to the district. So over these years, like Boston has typically like only hired in hard-to-staff areas, so like people who have special ed or English language certification, STEM fields. Some people apply and sort of wait years to find an opening. And so a more common thing that we see is teachers teaching, a few years in a charter and then moving to the district. And I think that is easily explained by the amazing salary scale in Boston, where you get a huge raise over the first 10 years of your career, and that is usually more money than is offered in the charter schools. But we just don't have a ton of those moves in terms of being able to look at that.
Yeah. Sarah, has anybody looked at that? Like when a given teacher moves from charter to district or district to charter, whether in Boston or anywhere, do they see like a mean shift in maybe like this class by year effect shrinking? That seems like a really important question for whether charters are just collections of, different types of teachers, or whether there's something about the charter setup, which I think is your story.
Do you know the answer to that question? I don't know the answer to that question.
I have a hypothesis
Yeah.
about the differentiation.
I don't know the answer to that question. Oh, who has the answer?
Virginia Sharp, a student here right now, is looking directly at that. I don't know if she's here.
All right, hang on, and she'll tell us. Eric?
So one hypothesis for the differences, one thing that will contribute to that is if in the public schools, if like a middle school math teacher is teaching like all sorts of different math classes, right? Whereas in the charter schools,
There's
there are,
one math.
I teach math, I teach sixth grade math, and that's all I teach. And that might be a management choice, but it also just could be mechanical because if they're opening up schools, everybody is only teaching sixth grade math.
So I have, I've looked at the course codes, and overwhelmingly, and this is not just in Boston, but in Massachusetts as a whole, it's coded as grade 7 math or grade 6 math or grade 8 math. It's not coded as pre-algebra, algebra, something like that. That does not mean that there's not tracking within and differentiation within, which you could look at by, I was talking about this with Chris earlier, by looking to see if there are different sort of baseline test scores in different classrooms. But we didn't see sort of anything super different in terms of classroom codes across the sectors.
And this is with all charters. This is the proven charters.
Yeah. Yep.
And the other one. So,
Yep.
so in principle, like, if you were more powered, you'd be able to see that this is even like more kind of like pronounced if we just focus on the proven charters.
That would be an extremely interesting finding.
Okay. And then what does this table look like for ELA?
So the pattern is very similar as well. So I can send you the table from the paper. Sophie?
You don't have any like more data on like what is going on in the classrooms, like disciplinary data or whatever. I know that's not the Massachusetts data, but I don't know what's the data.
So we could look. Something that we could look at that we haven't looked at is days of attendance. I've looked at that in the past and not seen a lot of action on it, but like that's a potential other thing that we can look at. Massachusetts stopped collecting that discipline data, and that discipline data in this particular data system, and before they stopped collecting that, the rumor was that different schools made different choices about whether or not they reported disciplinary incidents to the state, and thus not necessarily to trust what you saw. So we don't have other outcomes to look at. So.
Question about outside options, and I'm sorry if I missed this in the explanation. Do you consider if the expansion of middle schools somehow hurts performance at the district schools that are perhaps struggling to recruit students, some sort of like morale effect?
So that's not something that we are focusing on in this paper. There is like an interesting recent paper by Matt Ridley and Camille Terrier that looks in Massachusetts as a whole of the effect of charter school expansion on both finances and test scores, and as in general finds a small competition benefit in terms of test score outcomes. I don't believe they've differentiated it by expansion versus proven providers versus other charters, but I have no reason to believe that the district would respond super differently to the different sectors. One thing that we could do, I can't remember if we are doing this, would be just to look at the value added, using the value added from before and applying it to the after expansion in terms of looking at the fallback options and seeing if that is different. So we haven't explored that particular dynamic, but other evidence from other folks doesn't seem to point to that being a particular pathway that's going on. Mark.
I have two questions. One, is there other studies that have looked at sort of this decomposition for the charter networks? Okay. The second one is, with the expansion of charter seats in Boston, has there been like I know this sort of comparing winners and losers, has there been like an absolute a gain in just achievement in Boston relative to the rest of the state in some way? I'm like trying to like think about how we should like predict what that looks like given the expansion in addition to like these results for the lottery in particular.
Yeah. So we haven't estimated that particular thing, but I think drawing reasonable conclusions from what we would estimate would show that a gap is closing over time. Chris has done some work on gaps within Boston, but not sort of across the state, which is something that we could look at. All right, let me just wrap up in my last 2 minutes. A few things that we found is that the state was successful at selecting the schools to be proven providers. And the expansion campuses that these proven providers opened generated similar gains to their parent campuses. It didn't seem like demographics or the fallback option was explaining what was going on. It does seem like there is evidence for sort of highly standardized model coming from, in particular, training teachers to fit into a charter school model and to implement that model successfully. We looked at value added, and also we talked to some school leaders to think about that. And thinking about in terms of broader lessons in terms of how to replicate effective practices, it seems like standardization might facilitate effectiveness. To me, this is interesting because then there's this tension with the whole concept of a charter. So one of the reasons that charters exist is this idea that maybe with more autonomy, charters can be innovative and try new practices and do new things. These proven providers, the parent campuses, are now saying to the expansion campuses, you're a charter school, but you don't have any autonomy. You're going to implement our model because we know that it is successful for students. I don't think that's good or bad. It just is interesting to me given the spirit that many people talk about when they talk about charter schools in terms of what is going on. And so a caveat to think about is this is happening in Boston, where there is a somewhat infinite supply of young people graduating college who want to stay around, who are willing to work for relatively low wages and potentially be teachers in these schools. And while we did see a big increase in share of students enrolled, it's still a minority of the district as a whole, and we cannot necessarily generalize to further expansion or further expansion. And given the policy context in Massachusetts, I don't think we're going to have any opportunity anytime soon to look at potential further expansions in Massachusetts. Thank you so much for having me and for talking with me about charter schools.